So randomly one night I was sitting back going through Basketball Reference and looking at certain players and what they accomplished in recent NBA history. And I started to come across this consistent theme of lack of statistical excellence from a lot of players who played within this 5-year stretch of 2010 through 2015. The lack of excellence was so alarming that I did further research into it and immediately came out of my research thinking that between 2010 and 2015 might be one of the worst 5-year stretches in NBA history, but definitely the worst 5-year stretch in recent NBA history. Now, because this is going to be one of those videos, a video that's heavily based on my opinion, and I know I'm going to have to convince a lot of people who believe otherwise. So before I get to my opinions, there's two things that I have to do. The first thing is to thank today's sponsors, Swagbucks. For those out there who don't know, Swagbucks is a service that allows its users to earn gift cards and money through PayPal by doing things on the internet that you already do. Things such as taking polls, watching videos, playing games, and shopping online. See, the process is fairly simple. All you have to do is go to Swagbucks, take some polls, watch some videos, buy things online that you were already going to purchase, and through that you'll earn redeemable points. And then after that you redeem the points and you can earn gift cards from Starbucks, Walmart, Target, or again, you can just turn the redeemable points into money through PayPal. And to make things even better for you, Swagbucks will give you $5 for free, and all you have to do is click the link in the description and sign up for the service. And then from there, you're off to the races to earn and redeem as many points as you possibly can. Now, the second thing that I must do is present the facts. Now, when I looked at some of the top teams in the NBA, there were a healthy amount of 60 and 50 win teams in the league. However, during these stretch of years, there really weren't that many 48 to 45 win teams as you may have expected. However, there were a lot of teams who were bottoming out. And what made me dig a little bit deeper were some of the laughable records that I started to see from some of the organizations in the NBA during the stretch of years. And once I started to dig, I started to quickly recognize that some of these teams were performing so poorly that you can easily compare them to expansion teams in their first 5 years in the NBA. So that's exactly what I decided to do. Since the NBA-ABA merger, there have been 8 expansion teams. Out of those 8 expansion teams, since we're referring to a 5-year stretch, I decided to look at their first 5 years in the NBA. Now keep in mind, when you are an expansion team, you're at a massive disadvantage within your first 4 to 5 years in the NBA, largely due to the fact that A, the players that you receive from other organizations are players that they were willing to give up on for a reason, which then leaves these organizations desperately dependent on the draft classes that are coming up. And if there aren't any promising prospects that are entering the draft, well, more than likely these expansion teams are going to be bad for the next handful of seasons. So when you look at some of these winning percentages from these expansion teams, it makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is when I show you the winning percentages of the 8 worst teams in the 5-year window that we're referring to between 2010 and 2015. The winning percentages are so close to one another that it's embarrassing. To think that organizations who have been established in the NBA for several years went through a 5-year stretch that is comparable to an expansion team just shouldn't happen to begin with, especially when you consider that this is nearly a third of the NBA. Now, if that wasn't enough, it actually gets worse. I was looking at some of the numbers that certain players were recording during these stretch of years, and quite frankly, there really weren't that many impressive statistical feats at all. For example, when we look at the players who led the NBA in scoring over the course of these 5 years, none of them, except for Kevin Durant, led the NBA while averaging 30 points per game. Actually, during this entire 5-year stretch, Kevin Durant in 2014 is the only player to average 30 points or more. But going back to the scoring champions during these stretch of years, if we were to remove Kevin Durant in 2014 and look at the other 4 scoring champs, all of these points per game that eventually led the NBA in scoring are not that impressive at all. And actually, KD in 2011 and 2012, Carmelo Anthony in 2013, and Russell Westbrook in 2015 are literally some of the worst scoring champs in NBA history. On the screen, these are the lowest points per game average needed to lead the NBA in scoring for their corresponding seasons. Now, there's probably 2 things that you probably immediately recognize. The first thing is our 4 candidates are listed on this graphic, with 2013 Carmelo Anthony, 2015 Russell Westbrook, and 2012 and 2011 Kevin Durant. So all 4 of them actually made the cut in the bottom 18. The second thing you probably recognize is that there's a lot of players who participated in the 50s that are on this list, which means that some of these players actually played before the shot clock was invented, thus putting them in one of the slowest paced eras in NBA history. So to put this list into context, 5 of the 18 players who made this list were playing before the shot clock era, 2 of which, both recorded by George Mikan in 1950 and 1951, were putting up numbers that were on par with Carmelo Anthony and Kevin Durant, so that really isn't that impressive whatsoever. And if we were to remove those players who participated before the shot clock was invented, we are now referring to the worst 13 scoring champions in NBA history, and 4 of them participated within this 5-year window. But it doesn't stop there. I talked about this in my last video when I was referring to the evolution of the center position. If you haven't checked it out, make sure you do. However, I will expand the criteria to not only centers but power forwards as well. If you look at this 5-year stretch and include all of the players to average 20 points or 10 rebounds, there's only 17 players, 2 of which I'm going to round up for in both Blake Griffin and David Lee, who averaged 9.5 rebounds or greater, so I'm going to round up for them to give them 20 points and 10 rebounds. But again, only 17 players. To put into context how unimpressive that is, A, in 2013, there were 0 players to finish the season averaging 20 points and 10 rebounds, and B, we can go throughout NBA history and just look at 1 or 2 individual seasons, and you can clearly tell that for a 5-year stretch, there only being 17 players is ridiculously low. And then finally, when I went back and I looked at some of the players who were peaking around this 5-year window, the list wasn't that impressive at all. Matter of fact, I would argue that the list was pretty depressing. Now, don't get me wrong, players like Kobe and Dirk, they were still productive during the stretch of years, but we all kind of know that they really weren't 2010s players. And then when it comes to players such as Curry, Harden, and Westbrook, granted they had some productive years during this stretch as well. However, as we all know, their peak more or less would reside in the last 5 years in the 2010s rather than the early 2010s. But nevertheless though, this list really isn't that impressive even if we were to stretch it out to players such as Kobe and Curry. And oh yes, let's not forget, this is more or less my opinion, but I think majority of us can agree with this. Joakim Noah, Marc Gasol, and a 36-year-old Tim Duncan receiving first-team All-NBA honors is a bit ridiculous. And then you have Pau Gasol, who at his peak, while he was on the Los Angeles Lakers, being part of a team that was winning 55 to 60 plus games, and defensively at his best, was only making the 3rd All-NBA team. Yet somehow, some way, he makes a 2nd All-NBA team in Chicago when he's a worse defensive player, and offensively he wasn't the same player either. I'm not just sitting here trying to point the finger and claim that this stretch of years are straight trash and nobody should respect it, because quite honestly I think a lot of things transpired during this 5-year window that unfortunately left the NBA in void of talent for longer than probably many people expected. And I could go through multiple reasons and theories to why this happened, however I really just boiled it down to 2 reasons. A, there were a lot of injuries. And no, I'm not going to go over everyone's name, but just to name a few, players such as Michael Redd, Gilbert Arenas, Yao Ming, Amar'e Stoudemire, Dwight Howard, Shaun Livingston, Derrick Rose, Andrew Bynum, Brandon Roy, Greg Oden, Deron Williams, and Eric Gordon all should have been either playing better or just should have been active during these stretch of years, but unfortunately their careers were either cut short or altered significantly to the point where they just were never the same players nor had the same impacts. And then you take into consideration other players such as Kevin Love and Brook Lopez, who were active during these stretch of years, however had 2 or 3 years that were cut short due to injuries. And oh yes, let's not forget about the fact that both Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant, basically on back-to-back seasons, suffered from injuries as well, and that really kind of took OKC out of the picture. So all of that is really unfortunate, and I think a lot of people should really pay attention to what exactly was going on with injuries rather than just trying to point the finger. The second reason, and probably the most important one, is the philosophy of basketball was starting to be challenged, and teams that were unwilling to change were left behind. And unfortunately, many of us as fans also were unwilling to change our philosophy as well, thus lowering the standard for what a great player was in the NBA at that time. Now, the philosophy and ideology that I'm referring to is floor spacing and versatility at the power forward and center position that we started to see with the Miami Heat when they moved Chris Bosh to the 5 spot and started to run somewhat of a small ball lineup, if you want to call it that, since LeBron is like 6'8", 6'9", 250 plus pounds, but you kind of get what I'm saying. The Miami Heat experimenting with Chris Bosh really gave them an upper hand amongst some of their peers during these stretch of years, especially when you look at the NBA Finals. But like I said before, all teams were not willing to change, and a lot of teams were not even able to change. Because of this, if you actually go back and look at the players that were being drafted before this stretch of years and even during this 5-year window, it's pretty amusing to see how so many teams were unwilling to accept the inevitable. You have players such as Greg Monroe, Enes Kanter, Derek Favors, and Michael Kidd-Gilchrist being selected with some of the top 5 to 8 picks in their respective draft classes. And then even leading up into this stretch of years, there were players who were poised to go on to be very productive and successful players. However, because how drastic this change was, players such as Rondo, Josh Smith, and Rudy Gay became less impactful due to their inability to space out the floor. And even from a fan's perspective, due to the lack of talent that was in the NBA, regardless if it was just the change of the league or injuries, I honestly believe our standards started to slip a little bit. For example, I like Joakim Noah. Trust me, I do. But let's just be honest with ourselves, he really wasn't all that great. He did a couple of things here and there, great hustle guy, but I mean, just looking at some of his numbers, going back and watching him play, it's not that impressive whatsoever. Same thing can be said with other big men such as Roy Hibbert, Marc Gasol, and Al Jefferson. Or how about this? How many times did people make excuses for why players such as James Harden didn't have to play defense? Remember, this is the stretch of years in which James Harden flat out did not play defense. And looking back at it now, quite frankly, I don't even know of how many great two-way players were in the NBA at that time, especially on the perimeter. Outside of LeBron, Chris Paul, and maybe a year or two with Wade, that list is extremely short. However, in today's NBA, if we're just talking about strictly perimeter players, you have individuals such as Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and Giannis who can give you 25 plus points while also being elite level defenders. And so in my heart of hearts, even though when I look back and I see how piss poor the talent pool was due to injuries and unwillingness to change, I'm honestly happy that it happened. I think sometimes it takes a stretch of years of unsuccessful play for certain people to understand what is next for the NBA. And for majority of coaches, players, and organizations in the NBA, it took this 5-year window for people to understand to move in a different direction. And unfortunately, a bunch of injuries also transpired as well, which really left the NBA in void of talent. But it's very sunny on the other side, if I have to say so myself, because in my opinion, the NBA is about as great as it's ever going to get. However, please let me know what you think about this 5-year window that I'm referring to, and if you believe that it was as bad as I'm trying to make it out. And finally, before I go, huge shout out to today's sponsors and Swag Bucks. Make sure you click the link in the description, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.